Hey guys, so what we're talking about today is translating your favorite games into words of power. We've talked about animes before and things like that, but I wanted to use a concrete example of a game that I'm playing right now, dungeons that I'm running right now, and how I would turn that into a words of power adventure. Because some very bright minds out there have already done all the level design, all the encounter design, and they're fun adventures that I would like to play with the words of power rule set. So we're going to talk about how to convert the first dungeon for Guild Wars 2, Ascalonian Catacombs, into a Words of Power adventure. So the very first thing is to understand the story that we're playing. In this case, there is a legendary sword in the tomb of a mad king. The king went bananas and killed all his people, turned them all into ghosts, and now they're in these catacombs. In Guild Wars 2, this story is about a specific group of adventurers, but it is pretty easy to just slot in your own group of adventurers, tell them there's a sword there, and have them go get it. So, step one for translating something into words of power is figuring out what you want to translate. Do you want to translate a dungeon? Do you want to translate all the mechanics, an item, specific enemies? So I went through this dungeon and I cataloged everything that I would actually want to translate. So like trash mobs and encounters that don't really add anything, there's no challenge to them, they're just there to waste your time. I threw those out. The important thing is capturing the vibes, the feel of Guild Wars 2, the feel of the dungeon, and getting that to translate. That is what we're going for. I might mention that pillars of rubble barely hold up the ceiling or something, but I'm not going to say that there are 3 pillars like it's something you could interact with. Similarly, in this next room, there are a lot of stone coffins that you can open up and look in and get random battles from. We're not going to do that in Words of Power. We're going to maybe put some bones there. If the players really start digging in them, then maybe, but this room exists only as a locked door and gate guard Napa. Those are the 2 things we really want to capture here, because when you play through it, that's what you remember. That is the feeling that you come away with. Now, in Dungeons & Dragons, for example, you would have a lot of stats. Strength, Wiz, Dex, and Cha. And you have to make them balanced and relative to a basic human. You would have to figure out for each creature what its power level should be. Words of Power doesn't really work that way. You don't ever get so powerful that things are out-leveled, for example. It's kind of relative to baseline for everyone. And you don't have all those stats, you just have words and tags. You also measure the rooms in these little 1-inch squares so that you can perfectly replicate the terrain and the battle area for these rooms. But in Words of Power, we don't do that. The battle board keeps everything relative, and so there are no absolute distances. There's no need to measure. You can actually overlay the battle board over a screenshot of this room and just play that, and that'll be totally fine. The context of your players will determine what's relevant, what's not. So here we have Gate Guard Napa, our first big memorable guy. We see that he's tanky and that he's got the 2-handed hammer, and he's got a couple of special abilities. One is that big charge slam, and the other is an AoE knockdown. So when we go to stat this guy for Words of Power, we want to make sure that he's tanky, so we're going to give him above average HP, probably like 8s in all zones. Probably no armor because he's a ghost, and I don't want to deal with the logistics of that. In order to bring that charge attack into Words of Power, we'll probably make it take 2 actions, and we'll make a point of using it on the second action of the turn. This way it's telegraphed for the next round, and we can make it relatively strong. We can make it hit extra hard or something like that. The AoE knockdown will probably just knock down all adjacent spaces. And those will be his 2 big abilities. So in the next room, we see that there are traps, and there's a chain you have to pull. And we can get through that with skill checks. A room like this could take a TTRPG party hours to get through because they're just scared, right? They're going to spend infinite time trying to come up with a way to be 100% safe from the traps. So it's really kind of a toss-up whether or not you include something like that. I do think this dungeon, after it's translated, will have at least one trap room, and that'll just be a series of skill checks and chains and that sort of thing to navigate. I will probably not include these enemies while it's happening, because they're just so annoying. So this pressure plate is pretty easy to replicate in Words of Power. You just talk through it, right? But it'll take the players a couple of minutes to figure out. Now, TTRPGs are far more open than video games, so it should not require a boulder. If you want to require a specific item, don't use a pressure plate. Use, an altar with like a specific shaped key item or something. But if you just make a pressure plate, your players will 100% come up with a brilliant idea to not need a boulder. So this encounter is not just trash mobs, right? This is archers that kick you, that knock you down, a flight of stairs. And the whole thing is teaching you for the next memorable enemy how you're going to deal with that. That's okay to do. You just want to skip the fights that are absolute trash mobs. So this is the next memorable enemy. The two things that this enemy does is a knockdown shot, which is very annoying, and a knockdown or knockback slam. I don't know that that is an interesting encounter on its own. So you might add some mobs to this one. I would say that this boss might be one that you do a kind of defiance mechanic on. Maybe give them some armor that resists statuses until it's broken. But a fundamental truth of Words of Power is that if there's only one boss and a whole party can like surround them and just attack freely, they will die very, very quickly. So this is probably the trap room that I would leave, that I would include. We would probably talk about the room in zones, right? The entrance, up the stairs, down the stairs, and there would be skill checks to effectively dodge through it. Or alternatively, you can do a kind of line of sight thing, but that's a little more complicated and less supported by the rules. So I actually think that this graveling incursion is a great encounter for Words of Power. Words of Power is secretly a wave defense game. So having one really tanky spawner that spawns a bunch of little annoying guys is actually so valuable. It's kind of what we do. So I'd probably have the graveling spawner in D-Ring and then have the gravelings come anywhere from D-Ring as they spawn, not specifically from it. Now, why that opens the door, hard to explain. Now, this guy just hits really hard. He wiped me out pretty bad. I don't know that I could even describe a mechanic here. They just hit hard. So one thing that we might be able to do is combine Nappa the Archer and this one into one encounter. Or at least I would give them some underlings, some spawns, some ads. Now remember, in TTRPGs, your players might try to talk these guys down, assuming that they're not playing chars and the racism isn't the issue, but they might be able to negotiate. So we could do a lot of things, like we could give this captain a key that we can then steal or bribe or talk them out of or just kill them. And that could be a way to make this not so interesting encounter a bit more interesting, but still keep it in the game. So when you're describing these areas, you're going to describe them just like we're looking at it here. No UI, no measurements. Just what is the room? We're going to talk about the waterfalls. We're going to talk about the stone eagle faces. We're going to talk about the high ceilings. Because the battle board makes it all relative. The battle board could contain just this little platform where we fight, or it could contain the whole room. That is up to you when it's time to run the encounter, what seems appropriate. This is another really good setup for the battle board. 15 little buddies is how you want to play Words of Power. So this guy fights a lot like Gateguard Nappa, but he's got this shockwave. So what I would do with this shockwave is I would give him a maul, which is just a normal two-handed weapon, 1d8, 1d10. and I would give it the word shockwave. I would give him an ability that hits the same ring that he's on for 1d6 to the legs. This way, when players loot them all, they can still do thematically satisfying shockwave things, and I don't have to worry about balancing the ability, because an enemy has it, an enemy dies, the ability's gone. And players have to consume resources to do the same thing. It's not as big of a deal. I would make it take 2 actions, so that I could use it as his second action. And that means that he would start it on his turn, and I could describe him raising the hammer up and tell the players that next turn it's going to come down hard. And then they can move out of the way. And the goal of that is to capture the Guild Wars 2 feeling of like telegraphed moves and dodging, because Words of Power doesn't have a dodge mechanic. So in this way of splitting up a long action like that, we can have the players remember the pattern that it hits, and they can consume their resources to get out of the way. Okay, so now the dungeon becomes a bit of a boss rush. There are basically 3 bosses we have to go kill, in whatever order we feel like. So another Graveling Burrow. I would probably not do that twice for the TTRPG game. It just bogged down too much to be too samey. So unless there's like something else to make it interesting, I definitely would not do that twice. So you could use interesting terrain. This bridge is a really good example of something we would put on the battle board. We would block off the sides and just have one clear path down the middle through B and A. It takes forever to walk straight across a bridge, which leaves you vulnerable to the guys on the other side and makes it hard to focus all your fire from your side. You should still allow abilities to like clear the gap, to jump around the sides, that sort of thing. But yeah, stairs and bridges and things like that we can definitely replicate in the battle board to capture the feeling of the stuff. Okay, so this boss kind of bugged out on me, but basically he's an archer, and he's got a little buddy. You can see that he's up on this platform, and we have to go up kind of a narrow path to get to him to create a smaller area. So what I would probably do on this one is I would probably make it so that you can't walk between C and D. You have to take specific paths to switch between them. And that would really replicate a lot of the things that he's about to do. He bugged out on me, but his whole thing is that he shoots arrows at you, and then once he gets low enough, he teleports to this outer ring, and he's got little ghost wolves over there. So you're supposed to go over there and fight him there with his melee weapon, but he just didn't do it. He just healed up. It was kind of weird. But you can see how that fight would work in Words of Power pretty easily. I won't belabor the point. Okay, so I was not expecting this bonus event. This cave troll just pops out the wall. I have struggled with this guy so friggin' much. I can only kill him by cheesing him, because I'm bad at the game. But he's got 2 attacks, right? Well, 3. He's got 3 attacks. So he throws lightning, which chains around and hits everyone. He's got a 3 shockwave slam, which will one-shot you a lot. He's also got a big jump up and slam, which one-shots me. So the way that I would translate that into Words of Power is probably keep the chain lightning as a ranged attack that bounces between everyone. It seems pretty straightforward to me, but yeah, so his fear would make you run back a range and waste your turn. His lightning ball would bounce between everyone on the same ring. And the 3 shockwaves would probably just remain a lot like the shockwave and just hit the ring that he's on. What makes this interesting is the way that these abilities would interact with Words of Power. So he's got a fear ability and a lightning ability. And characters in Words of Power are defined by tags and words. So you might have a fearless tag that would make this not work on you. You might have some kind of item or characteristic of yourself that makes the lightning ineffective. You might cast a spell that makes the lightning not bounce or reflects it in some way. And so these simple mechanics become more interesting when you actually play the game and roleplay your characters against these characters. And it's TTRPGs. It's wild, you know? All right, next boss. So this is actually a duo boss. It's made up of two lovers, and when they're near each other, they get additional abilities they're strong. In this video, I don't really let that happen. I don't let them live very long. But this would also be a good Words of Power boss, because you could make it so that when they're next to each other on the battle board, on the same ring, that they get additional abilities. So I had to check the guide to figure out what these guys do, because I don't know. Looks like one of them gets to reflect all projectiles, and the other launches you back if you get close to her. That's their ability when they're together. I think that would be a really interesting Words of Power boss. Trying to separate these two on the battle board would be an interesting problem. It seems that Relena summons a lot of lightning storms, and Vassar summons phantasmal mages that inflict a lot of condition. So this could all be translated to Words of Power. We would give them probably words so they cast actual spells, which is important because then they can be counterspell. I think that'll be a fun one to put together. Kasha is another one I had to go to the wiki to figure out, like, what does she do, because it just didn't work out quite right. Looks like she's supposed to summon some dudes, do some lifesteal, and have some AoE condition effects on the ground. That should be simple enough to replicate in Words of Power as well. Alright, finally the king. Looks like his two big things are lingering fire damage on the ground, makes a little dangerous spot, and he pulls everyone into him with a big swipe. This is another one that I think you probably want to add some extra enemies in here. It's just, Words of Power is really bad at having one enemy and then a whole party. Okay, that's it. That's the whole dungeon. So there's not really that much work to do. It's not a long dungeon, but in tabletop terms, it's going to take a long time because players can spend multiple sessions on one room full of traps. So everything that we have here is going to take longer than we think. I'm going to run through it real quick, and we're going to stat up a couple of things. I'm not going to stat everything in this video, but I will link to a fully statted version of the dungeon. I just want to talk about the specifics of how I would do these things.